since we don't have a monster of the week to discuss, I thought it would be a good idea to revisit some of the monsters we've talked about on the podcast before,
Sure.
in the light of gameplay mechanics specifically, though. Over the last month or so, we've discussed a handful of monsters from like ether snakes and to ichors and stuff like that. Could you share some of the mechanics involved with the monsters that we've talked about?
Yeah, so I'll just go through all three, really.
Okay.
So starting with the ether snake, as we said before, it can create portals to lunge at their foes from any direction, always taking advantage of the element of surprise. In game, this means that if something is blocking the path between you and the ether snake, it doesn't care. It'll just teleport right next to you, or in your space rather, and attack you when the game triggers the monster movement and attacks. On top of that, it also, like a normal, it's a venomous snake. It injects poison, which means if you're not tough enough, if you don't pass a certain skill check, you'll take extra damage and it'll slow you down. The Outer Fiend. The Outer Fiend is a demonic alien that thrives on insanity due to its love for experimenting on other living beings. So something I didn't mention before is that a player's character can go insane. I guess I may as well just talk about it right now. There are tons of things that can interact with insane characters. It's just another status effect, and it gives really interesting results. Specifically, the Outer Fiend, whenever you fail a dread check against the Outer Fiend, and if you're insane, it just attacks you regardless of range. It's a melee monster, but if you're on the other side of the room and you're insane, it does some kind of mental attack each time you fail this dread check. So what that does is it heavily accelerates that character's death. The reason being, obviously, if you're insane, your sanity is equal to 0. But when you take further sanity damage, it actually translates it into just taking damage to your health instead. So losing sanity and health will cause you to die really fast. But if you happen to kill it, if you remember its eyes being, the galaxies in the background and whatnot, when it dies, it kind of bursts into this darkness that fills the room. So the room becomes in darkness once it dies. The monster we spoke about last week was the Sentient Ichor. There are two main classes of items, artifacts and common items. The Sentient Ichor is not only completely immune to common items and weapons, but it'll actually eat them up if you try to use them on it. And it gets even worse. The Sentient Ichor is an aberration. It's much scarier than the other categories of monsters. It can't gain status effects like stunned, slow, or panicked. Failing dread checks against it will cause the Sentient Ichor to steal 1 point of each attribute from you for a whole round, and that includes max health. And lastly, guests can't even see it unless it's in the same space as any guest. If one guest sees it, then they all kind of see it.
So you mentioned a lot of these monsters having abilities that are like ignoring terrain and stuff like that. Can they move between the rooms, or are they fixed to certain rooms, like when you find them?
So monsters will try and follow players during the mansion phase. The thing is, if you leave a room, like I explained before with room permanence, if you leave a room and you're the last player, there's no more player-controlled guests or servants in that room, it disappears. It goes into the ether, this limbo outside of time and space. And so while the beginning of the game will be fairly easy to run from monsters because you can just leave rooms with them in it, the room can reappear and it actually remembers the monsters within it. So monsters can start to pile up if you don't take care of them. And as the game progresses and guests have turned into servants are player characters, so they can kind of herd monsters toward guests because they cause room permanence themselves. So the answer, I guess, would just be, yeah, they can, so long as there are two things causing room permanence between the room that they're coming from and the room they're going towards.
Also, I've been meaning to ask you, you've been talking about all these different types of monsters. Is there like a traditional boss type monster in Dimension Door?
So no, the game is actually not traditional in that sense. You become the boss monster when you die. That's what a servant is. It's this big boss monster and you control it. And the other guests will have to fight it or run from it. While I did explain how aberrations are by far the scariest and have the highest potential of deadliness amongst all the monster types, it's still multiple steps below compared to servants. So the most dangerous monsters come from the evil within us. and this mansion causes your dead character to physically manifest that inner evil, turning you into its servant of the house.
So when you become the servant, what happens to the other monsters? Are they still in the mansion? Do you interact with them as a servant in any way?
So each servant, like each guest, is very unique. They have different abilities and they have different rules they kind of follow. And they also have different win conditions. Certain servants can control monsters. Most can't. But you're probably asking because of the whole herding thing I was talking about.
Yeah.
So a servant is a player character that causes room permanence. So if you're in a room with monsters and in an adjacent room there is a guest, the monsters are going to start moving in towards that guest. They totally ignore servants. They're like friends. They're like the best of friends. And so
they just ignore each other.
Yeah, that's the best of friends. They start swarming in trying to kill the guests. And that's how servants can kind of do this herding, tactic to bring those monsters towards them, and then they can leave the room and start attacking that guest too. Or they can get zealous and just jump into that room and start doing crazy stuff according to their abilities against those guests.
I really hope there's like a sheepdog themed servant of the house, so that way you can like actually herd them. But all right, on that note, I'd like to wind us down a bit. We'll answer last week's question of the week. Last week we asked, what kind of occupation would you like to see in Dimension Door? And I kind of mentioned it to you after the episode last week, but I'd really like to see a game designer in Dimension Door. You can kind of base it off you. And,
oh god, it would die every time.
And I think it should be like really cocky and like talk to the players kind of like Deadpoolish. And yeah, it should probably die every time. Maybe just throw it in as like a
he
bonus.
is a servant. How about that? The game designer is a servant. Every time you die as a servant, you come back as that servant. You just lose a turn.
yeah, that sounds good.
That's perfect.
So this week, our question is, what topic would you like to see us cover in one of these installments of Inspiral Gaming Weekly? So let us know. Maybe we'll be able to get to it one of these weeks. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with another installment of Inspiral Gaming Weekly.